Here we are, early March, and spring is obviously just around the corner. And you know what they say about spring. In spring, young men and young ladies' minds turn to, you guessed it, repotting. So tonight we're going to talk about repotting, and we're going to talk about techniques for repotting of bonsai that I have primarily learned from my teacher, Ryan Neal at Bonsai Mirai up in Oregon. And a lot of this may be basic stuff to some of you, and to others of you that are newer to bonsai, it may be new information, or you may have questions about it. And so I would invite you to please interrupt or pose a question on the chat, or however you want to do it. I'm happy to be interrupted, and I'm happy to try to answer questions that you may have about repotting bonsai. We're going to be working this evening with a twin trunk Colorado spruce, and I'll tell you more about that tree as we go forward. But the biggest question that we come to when we talk about repotting is, why do we do it at all? Because repotting a bonsai, which is essentially a tree in a pot, is my friend Todd Schlafer, who is our in-house bonsai professional, refers to it as open heart surgery for bonsai, because it's a major operation, and we should not do it lightly. And the other thing is that we don't repot bonsai on a schedule. So it's not like we say, well, here's a tree, and every 2 years we need to repot this tree. No, that's not the idea. The idea is there's got to be a reason that we repot the tree. And there are three main reasons why we repot bonsai. First and foremost, probably, is that there's a loss of water percolation through the soil. So if you're watering this tree and you see that there's water standing on the top of the soil, and it takes forever to drain through, that's a pretty good indication that the tree is not draining properly. And when a tree is not draining properly, that means that there's an imbalance of the water and oxygen in the roots, that both of which are needed for the health of the tree. And it doesn't matter what kind of soil mixture you have. At some point, components of that soil mixture will begin to break down, and the soil will become, instead of percolating, it'll become more solid. And that's a real problem for the tree, a lack of drainage and a lack of proper balance of water and oxygen in the root mass. So that's the first reason. The second reason, which is sort of related to that, but is that you obtained a tree that was in nursery soil, or it's a tree that's been collected and it's in a different kind of soil substrate that was appropriate for the tree when it was first collected. And now you want to get it into a bonsai container. The tree's been growing well, it's healthy. Nursery soil, by the way, because nurserymen, unlike people who grow bonsai, their main interest is financial. So they don't want to be watering their trees 3 times a day during the summer. So they use soil that is much more dense and much more organic than what we may be using for bonsai. So if you have a tree that's in dense nursery soil, or a tree that's in native collected soil, perhaps with some pumice in a box or an Anderson flat, and you want to get that into a bonsai container, that's the second major reason for repotting. The third is more visual and aesthetic in nature, and that is a desire to change the inclination or the orientation of the tree in the container, or to remove it or to move it to a more appropriate size and shape of container than it has been in. So if, for example, we have a tree that's been growing as an informal upright, and we're thinking, gee, we want to train this tree as a semi-cascade, well, obviously that's a significant change to the angle or the inclination of the tree or the orientation of the tree, and we need to repot it in order to put it into that different orientation or different style. So those are the three primary motivations, if you will. There are others, but those are the three primary motivations for wanting to repot your tree. Let's talk a bit about preparation. So, you know, oftentimes when I've done in-person workshops, repotting workshops in the past, the first thing I ask the audience or the members that are gathered is, do you like to cook? And people look at me like, what the hell has that got to do with bonsai and with repotting? And I say to them, there's a phrase, a French phrase in culinary arts, which is called mise en place. And what that means literally is everything in its place. And it's very important when we are, just like with a chef, to have all of his ingredients in front of him, chopped and prepared in whatever way it's necessary before he begins to put together a dish. It's also important that we begin the repotting process by making sure that we've got all of the tools, implements, soil, and so forth around us, so that we're not running around trying to figure out how to put this together when we're in the process of depotting an existing bonsai. So, you know, there's a whole array of things that we really need to have in front of us. When I repot bonsai, I like to use a big plastic tray like this, which you can buy at, I guess, Home Depot or any number of places. And I put my turntable in the center of this. And for most trees, what I like to do is set the tree on that turntable before I begin work, because then any of the soil that I'm taking out of any of that container will fall into this tray instead of falling onto the floor. Now, if you want to have all this stuff on the floor, that's fine too, but it's a lot neater if you can put things in the tray and then dispose of the old soil or whatever you're going to do with it afterward. Then we have an array of tools that are necessary to properly repotting bonsai, and we'll show you some of those. I'm not going to bore you by taking you through the description of all these things, but we have to have all these things at hand. So everything from our chopsticks to our commas and our brushes and our drainage screen, and a bottle of clear water to keep the roots moist as we're depotting the tree. All of those things we need to have at hand. So make sure that you've got all of your tools and all of your implements there, and readily at hand, so that you can you're not scrambling around trying to find things as you're doing that. And obviously, one of the things we're going to need as we go forward in the repotting process is soil. I know that there's obviously a great deal of controversy about what kind of soil components one should use for bonsai. And I'm sure that his presentation later this month. Uh, Paul Koenig will be talking about different aspects of soil, and he's very knowledgeable about horticulture, and he may be telling you some things that are a little different from what I'm telling you. But again, given the fact that I'm a disciple of Ryan Neal, for most of my trees, especially conifers, I use a blend of Akadama, pumice, and scoria. And if you look at those components, on the right is the scoria, which is essentially crushed lava. In the center here is pumice, and here is Akadama. Akadama is imported from Japan, essentially. It is, contrary to popular opinion, it's not fired. It's dried clay from a certain area of Japan. And each of these components has a different role to play in the bonsai soil mixture. On the left here, at the very left, you see a mixture of those three components: 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, for most of the trees that we deal with. So, what are the properties of these different soil components? First of all, pumice, which is the substance in the center here, is a terrific holder of moisture, a terrific reservoir, if you will, of moisture in the soil. Scoria, on the other hand, is a terrific oxygenator or aerator of the soil. It creates those tiny little areas of oxygen. And again, we have to keep in mind that bonsai soil needs to have a balance of oxygen and water in order to be beneficial to the roots. And Akadama, the substance here on the left, has a peculiar ability to convey nutrients to the roots, nutrients that are put into the soil separate from these soil components. That process is called cation exchange. And there are other elements that have that same property of cation exchange, such as bark mulch, for example. But bark mulch in your soil breaks down extremely quickly, turns to mush essentially. Akadama will break down eventually. Doesn't matter how hard the akadama is, it will break down eventually, and that's another reason why we need to repot. But the combination of these three elements is the soil mixture that I use for most bonsai trees, especially conifers. Now, I want to perhaps dispel another myth or another assumption. Sometimes this soil mixture is referred to as a boon mixture. What does that refer to? Well, it refers to a bonsai artist, a bonsai professional in California, whose name is Boon Manakativipart. Manakativipart. He is a very well-known and very highly respected bonsai artist and bonsai professional in California, and who has advocated this soil mix. But it didn't come from Boone. It came from originated in Japan, and it's advocated by a number of respected bonsai professionals in Japan and in the United States. So calling it a Boone mix is a little bit of a misnomer, if you will. It's really a very universally recognized, at least in the Japanese bonsai culture, mix of ingredients. Any soil that you use for bonsai, any of these components need to be sifted. So, I use a simple circular sifting mechanism for soil. And the first thing I do when I take these ingredients out of their respective packages is I screen them through a 16th-inch screen. The purpose of that is to take out all the dust and fines out of the soil, so that we don't, those dust and fines will block the drainage of the container and defeat the purpose of having this well draining soil. So each of those components is sifted through the 16th inch container. Then the second thing I do with those components individually is I sift them through an 1/8 inch screen, and that enables me to separate the smaller particles, the 1/8 inch and smaller, into one batch of stuff, and the larger particles into a separate batch. And those two separate batches of the smaller soil particles and the larger particles, the larger ones, same composition of the three components, will form what we call our drainage layer in the bonsai container. The smaller ones will be our fill soil. So there's a fairly extensive process. I know people like to buy pre-mixed soils, and that's fine if you want to do that. Although even with pre-mixed soils, I would strongly recommend that you screen them through the 16th inch screen to remove dust and fines. But if you want to make your own soil, which I do, it's a labor-intensive process, but it's kind of fun. You take a whole day and you make a 5-gallon bucket of bonsai soil.
Hey, Tom, we have a quick question on
Yeah.
the soils. Do you ever add some of the older soil from the pot it's in to preserve mycorrhiza, or do you add mycorrhiza as part of putting new soil together?
I have not added mycorrhiza specifically to the soil mix, but the one thing, and I'll get to that, is that when we repot bonsai, we never remove all the old soil. We never bare root pretty much any tree, especially conifers. With some deciduous trees, there is a, depending on who you talk to, it is possible to completely bare root deciduous trees. Although I don't typically do that, but with conifers, you absolutely, and especially pines, you absolutely do not want to remove all the old soil from the roots. So while I have never specifically added mycorrhiza to the soil, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't. I mean, if that's your inclination, there's certainly nothing wrong with it. But mycorrhiza is a naturally occurring beneficial fungus in the soil, and you'll see some of it in a minute when I pull this spruce out of the pot. Any other questions?
I'm over here.
So these are just some blow-ups of the soil mixture that we're talking about. These are the larger particles for the aeration mix, and the smaller one.
Do you actually have any notebooks? Oh, here's one.
Can we ask that everybody mute, please? Thank you. So the next thing I want to talk about is once we have all of our preparation, all of our tools together, and we've got our soil mix and so forth. The next subject is removing the tree from the existing container. And the first step in removing that bonsai from the existing container, assuming that it is in a bonsai container or even in a growing box, is to separate the root mass from its adherence to the vertical walls of the pot. Because if you think about it, as the tree grows, it's going to continue to expand. The root mass is going to continue to expand. And what tends to happen is that after the tree's been in a pot for 3 or 4 or even 5 years, it will adhere, those perimeter roots will adhere to the interior walls of the pot. And that's why it's so difficult, or it can be so difficult, to remove it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about eliminating that adhesion between the root mass and the interior walls of the pot. In order to do that, we use a tool which is called, actually Ryan Neal refers to it as a comma. Now, I don't know whether that term comma stands for some kind of Japanese term, or whether it's just that the shape of the tool looks like the punctuation mark that is a comma. But here's a couple of examples of commas. And as you can see, they come in different sizes. This one doesn't have teeth. This one does. And depending on the size and the depth of the container that you're dealing with, you can use one or the other. I happen to have two of these, and for this operation, I'm going to be using mainly this bigger one because it's a fairly deep pot. So the process of this first step in taking the tree out of the pot is to go around the perimeter of the pot with it sitting on flat on a surface. And you can see what we're doing here is working that comma between the edge of the pot and the root mass, and working all the way around the pot that way. Now, it's difficult to illustrate without having an actual video, but the action of the comma is not one of digging into the soil and sort of ripping through that edge. It's really more one of scraping, you know, going all the way around the pot, scrape, 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 and you're going to be digging a little deeper into that edge of the pot, but not ripping away at the interior roots of the pot. So as you go around, you continue that scraping process, and pretty soon you'll get to the bottom of the pot, and that's really where you want to be in order to free up that whole perimeter. After we've had the pot in that horizontal position, then we can lift it up into an angle like this and do that same operation with the comma all the way around the perimeter. Lifting up the pot enables us to release some of the soil that's coming out as we're doing that scraping motion around the perimeter. But we also have to be careful as we do that to angle the pot in a way when we're scraping that excess soil does not come down onto the trunk of the tree, especially when we have a trunk with wonderful bark like this one, because the soil particles will get embedded in that bark and it's almost impossible to get them out. So you always want to have the tree up at an angle where you can do this operation, but have the soil flow into the tray or whatever you're using below it. This is just a close-up of that same operation. And again, remember, it's basically a sort of scraping operation as opposed to digging into the soil and trying to pull everything out at the same time. After we've done that whole perimeter operation and we're pretty convinced that we've gotten our comma all the way down to the bottom of the pot, and we've created space essentially between that edge of the pot and the root mass, then we can go down below and cut the retaining wire, the anchorage wire that's been holding this tree in the pot. Now let me back up for a second and say, because you might be asking, well, why don't we do this beforehand? Well, the reason is that when we're doing the operation with the comma, removing that edge, we still want to have something holding that tree into the pot. We don't want it to just fall out. So so this is the operation that we perform after we've done the perimeter cutting. The other thing that I wanted to mention, or I forgot to mention, is that, you know, some people have said, well, when you're going around with this comma, with this little scythe, essentially, you're cutting roots. Yes, you are. You will be cutting some perimeter roots, but the objective is to cut those roots only at the edge, only at the edge. You're not trying to cut interior roots at this point. You're simply trying to sever those perimeter roots that are basically cementing the tree into the pot. And that isn't going to hurt anything, because effectively, by the time we're all done, we're going to be trimming some of those perimeter roots anyway. What you don't want to have happen is using that comma to go down in and all of a sudden latch onto some big root that's going into the interior of the root mass and ripping that where you might not want to rip it. So that's the whole idea. Here we'll go down below and we'll cut these. In this case, there's wire going in two directions. We'll cut those wires and we'll pull them back, and then we'll trim them right to the place where they come into the drainage holes, in this case, right at the edge there, to prevent any kind of resistance when we're trying to pull the root mass out of the pot. In addition to that, and something I want to point out here, this is a kind of an unusual situation. These little pieces of bamboo here, and you can see them actually in the previous photo also here, they were put in when we initially styled and potted up this tree. And the purpose of those little strips of bamboo was to hold guy wires, actually. These are thin wires that were going up through those holes and up into the tree to pull down branches. So in both cases, here and here, those were essentially supports or tie downs for guy wires that were going up into the tree to pull branches down. And those are being removed at this point as well. Actually, they've been cut up above a long time ago. So we'll be cutting all these evenly with the bottom of the pot. And then my feeling is we should also remove the wire on the drainage screens that are extending down. And the reason for that is, and cut those right even with the bottom of the drainage holes. The reason for that is the drainage screens, which are on the interior of the pot, obviously, often adhere themselves to the root mass. And if you don't cut these wires that are holding the drainage screens down, they're going to provide additional resistance to removing the root mass from the pot. So we cut those off too, and assume that the drainage screens are going to come up, the plastic drainage screens are going to come up with the root mass when we remove it. So we cut those as well. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So once we've done all that, once we've done our comma work around the perimeter of the pot, and we've cut all the anchorage wires and drainage screen wires down below, the tree should be reasonably able to be lifted out of the pot. We test that, as I'm showing in this photograph, by finding a place where we can access the tree. And again, with a tree that's got really nice bark on it like this, and especially pines, which are valued for their bark, we find a place where we can place our hand that's not on the trunk, but on, for example, a piece of gin, or in this case, the underside of this branch, a place where we can get a little bit of leverage. And we test whether we can lift that tree out. If the tree feels loose, if it feels like you can move it out, then, you know, get one hand on the pot and the other hand lifting up on the tree, and hopefully you'll be able to lift it right out like this. If that doesn't happen, if the tree seems pretty stubborn and doesn't want to move, then the next step would be to work again with the comma all the way around the root mass to try to see if there are any areas that are resisting being taken out of the container. And having done that, you should be able to lift out, but you have to have patience, right? It doesn't necessarily all happen as quickly as this. And the other thing I've thought about, or the other thing I've done, is that sometimes you can take a really beefy chopstick and stick it down between the edge of the pot and the soil mass and use it as a pry lever in several places around if there's some reason why the tree is sticking to the bottom of the container. But in this case, it lifted out quite nicely. Now, a little aside, for a tree that has a solid, well-established root mass, this process is generally pretty straightforward. But sometimes you're taking a tree out of a growing box or an Anderson flat, a collected tree that's been growing in that kind of environment, and it may not have a real solid root mass like this. It may have a fairly loose conglomeration of soil and roots. And in that case, you have to be extremely careful taking the tree out, because it's very easy for that root mass to sort of essentially fall apart. And then all of a sudden you can lose a clump of roots, or you can lose a significant chunk of the existing soil that you really want to retain. So that can be and you don't really ever want to bare root the tree. So that's a very delicate operation, and one in which it is beneficial to have a helper, because you really want to get your hands under the root ball at that point, under the root mass, and lift it out as a clump, even though it may be very loose and wanting to fall apart. So that's a really delicate operation, and I've had that experience working up at Ryan's place, where we've had to deal with that kind of situation. So here we have the root mass as we've taken it out. Haven't done anything to it yet, but you can see it's basically hanging together quite nicely. And from here, we can begin to work with it. You can see that it's fairly dense, not as dense as some others I've repotted, but has it's hanging together. It's got both trunks in it. They are woven together. So, so what's our next step? Our next step is what I'm referring to as cleaning and combing the root mass. When we take the tree out of the container, out of its existing container, we've got this sort of chunky root mass that we're dealing with. And the first step that we're going to take, well, first of all, let's talk about what our objective is here. what we want to do is to improve drainage. We want to improve the balance of water and oxygen in the soil mass. And we want to encourage new fine roots to grow in that new soil medium that we're going to provide them. So we need to remove roots that are matted, and especially at the bottom of the root mass. And we want to open up that root mass as much as possible to allow water to drain through it and to have oxygenation. But we don't, again, want to bare root the tree. So let's look at what this root mass looked like when I took it out of there. This is the bottom of the root mass. Here's the mycorrhiza that we talked about, the beneficial fungus. But you can also see that there are matted roots at the bottom of this. Now these are not as much matted as we might see in another tree. I've taken trees out, especially pines, and there'll be a whole solid mat of roots down here. Ryan Neal likes to take a putty knife or a paint scraper and place it between that mat of roots and the rest of the roots in the tree and literally pry away that mat. I have never used that technique myself, but it seems like a pretty good way to do it. But what I have done is I've taken my chopstick and I begin to pry away at those mats, at those matted roots at the bottom. For the most part, those matted roots are not doing us any good. They're really inhibiting the drainage and the natural flow of water and oxygen in the soil mass. So you can take your chopstick and literally begin to pry away carefully, obviously, at those roots. And some of them you'll find are just leggy roots that don't have very much fine rootage on them, and they can be pried away and cut away because behind them in the bottom of this root mass are really good roots that we can use for further development of the tree. Here again is more mycorrhiza in the bottom of that root mass. So we work that, and we continue to work, and what we'll find is in the bottom of this root mass, you can see all the old soil coming out of here, and you'll also see old native soil that existed here in a previous potting that we're going to be working at pulling out, and so we're basically working the Japanese term for the underside, the central part of the underside of the root mass is called the shin, S-H-I-N, shin, and that is the area where it's most difficult to get new roots to grow, because all the roots want to go to the outside where the water is and around the perimeter. But getting this healthy sheen is very, very important to the health of the tree. And a lot of times going in here, you'll find old soil, old nasty stuff that you really want to pull out in order to replace it with new soil that's much more beneficial and drains much better. So we're working the bottom of that root mass, and all of a sudden we find not only some of these leggy roots, but we find a great big old root like this that is dead for all intents and purposes. It has no fine roots coming off of it. They're just big chunks of this stuff sometimes that you'll find at the bottom of the tree, and all they do is inhibit the ability to repot this into a better soil mixture. So we cut those, and it really isn't doing any harm to the tree by doing that. But we have to be very careful when we look at some of these big roots that grow underneath here to make sure that a root is not coming out here and ending up over here someplace supporting other rootage on the other side of the tree. In this case, you can clearly see this is a dead end root that just can be cut away. So working away, continuously working away at the bottom of the root mass, now you can begin to see a lot of the leggy old roots that are, and not old roots necessarily, just some of these are leggy roots, others are fine roots that we're going to retain. The one thing that we have to be mindful of as we do this is to keep those roots hydrated, right? So we come in and we spray them with water. And this is particularly important if you're working in an arid environment. I try not to repot trees outside, especially when it's warm outside and the sun is shining, because those roots will dry out so quickly. So I try to repot trees indoors as much as possible. But even indoors, when you're working in a controlled environment, you still have to aerate, you still have to hydrate those roots as you're working, because you want to keep them, you want to keep them wet and not have them dry out. A dry root is a dead root. So you need to be aware of that. And then what we do is come in, and when we're seeing all these miscellaneous roots at the bottom of that mass, we want to do some trimming, some pruning. And so we come in with our root scissors and cut back some of that to further open up that portion of the root mass. Here you see all these sort of leggy roots that really don't have a lot of fine roots attached to them that are feeding the tree. Those can basically all be cut away. Why? Because we have a whole bunch of very fine roots behind that are going to support that tree in the future. So these things are not essential to the health of the tree. Now I want to talk about another little aside here, which is that the description that I've been talking about in this narrative and with these photos so far has to do with a tree whose inclination, whose angle, if you will, of potting is really not going to change much. I mean, we're pretty much going to be standing this tree up the way it was before, albeit in a different container, albeit with a reduced root mass. But if we are going to, if part of the repotting process is to change the inclination or the angle of the tree, say from an informal upright to a semi-cascade, for example, then there's some other considerations that need to take place as we're doing this work on the root mass, and that is when you're looking at making that change of angle, what portion of the root mass is creating the greatest inhibition or the greatest obstacle to achieving that new angle? And it may be that, you know, there's one side of the root mass that is really interfering with the ability to accomplish that change. In that case, we need to think hard and look hard at how we can reduce that portion of the root mass, obviously without endangering the life of the tree, in order to make that tree fit into that new style, if you will, or that new design. And that's a So once we've done the initial cleaning, then we need to see, okay, can I reduce this side of the root mass in order to achieve that? And do I still have enough healthy roots here to maintain the health of the tree? And that's a whole different kind of process that one needs to go through, and it's a more complicated process than the one that we're looking at today. But if you're looking at doing that, you need to keep that in mind as you're moving forward with the repotting process. So it's a question of what is my biggest point of obstruction, if you will, in achieving that change of direction or change of angle. That isn't happening here, but I wanted to bring that up because it is a different approach to analyzing and treating the root mass if you're considering that kind of change. So here we are. We now have a tree with a root mass, and we've worked the underside of that root mass. The second thing we're going to do after we finish with the underside is we're going to use our chopstick and we're going to work around the top of the root mass, combing outward from the interior to the exterior with our chopstick, so that we begin to loosen up all the top of the soil, and we begin to remove some of the debris and weeds, as you can see in this instance, from the top of the surface of the soil.
Tom, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
A question has come up in the chat box about how much soil you removed, how much of the root mass you removed in this process.
And I guess the answer is it depends, but I would generally say that you would probably never want to remove more than 50% of the existing root mass. And that's again, I say it depends because it also depends on how substantial or how dense the root mass is. If you're dealing with a tree that's coming, for example, out of a growing container, and it has pretty minimal roots for the size of the tree, and the roots are fairly loose as opposed to this kind of situation, you may not want to remove more than 20% of the roots, or you may want to retain all of them. So it's really a question of, how substantial is that root mass, and how much do I feel comfortable being able to prune. But I would say, as a general rule of thumb, you would never want to remove more than 50%.
Got it. Thank you.
Tom, I have another question,
Sure.
kind of in the same vein. Do you soak the tree before this operation? Maybe the question is, watering, letting it dry out. What's the approach?
I would say, when you say soak the tree, I would not advocate submerging it, but I do think it's a good idea for the tree to be hydrated when you're doing this kind of exercise. So maybe watering it like the day before, so that it has a fair degree of moisture in the root mass. It isn't necessarily to water it immediately before, but I don't think you want to have the roots be too dry when you're doing this. So I would water it thoroughly the day before, and then so when you're working it, the soil is relatively moist.
Thanks.
Okay, so here we are combing out the top of the soil, the surface roots, radially all the way around, radially. And what will happen as a result of that is you'll find that there are roots around the perimeter. You don't see it so much in this slide, but around the perimeter that'll get combed out. And some of those roots will be long and stringy, and you can cut them. You can just reduce it. Because the whole idea of this is we're trying to get down to a root mass that is healthy, viable, but reduced in size, so that potentially we can plant this tree in a smaller container and still have it give it room for these roots to grow into that new soil. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about containers because, excuse me, obviously the next step, once we've taken that tree down to this essential soil mass, and we've trimmed and pruned roots that we feel are extraneous at that point, then we need to think about what's happening with the container that we're going to put that tree into. So as I indicated in this note, matching a new container to the tree presents challenges. And the challenges are not only in terms of the visual enhancement of the final composition, but also the tree's overall health and its ability to thrive. So one of the things we do when we, before we begin to repot, or even before we take the tree out of its existing container, is we go and look at whatever containers we have available, and we pick out some and say, geez, these might be candidates, you know, for putting this tree. That's always a bit of a speculative operation, because until we take the tree out and see what the essential root mass has to be, we won't really know which of these containers are going to work or are even feasible for this revised tree. And but we do that anyway. We pick out the ones we think are possible candidates, and we sort of line them up and try to figure out where we're going to go from here. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about this tree because it's important to understand where I'm coming from with this particular tree. So the question, our first question this evening was, why do we repot? And the question with respect with respect to this particular tree is, why do I want to repot this tree? And there are a few reasons why I had in mind to do with this. And that is, first of all, this tree has been in this container for about 4 years. And I had reason to believe that the existing soil had probably broken down and was inhibiting the kind of drainage and flow of oxygen and water that I was wanting to have. Secondly, the container is a beautiful container. It's a Sarah Rayner container, and it's really a nice pot, but it's oversized for this tree. It's too deep, and there's something about the character of the container itself in terms of its walls, the shape of the container, that makes it appear a bit massive, I think, for this tree. This tree it's it's in a way, its main trunk is fairly masculine in character, but my feeling is that the overall character of the tree is somewhat more delicate and more feminine. And so I feel like the size of this container is just a bit too large for it. Um, so that was another consideration. And oops, gosh, keep losing it here. And then the third consideration is that I really wanted to change the front of the tree subtly. Here is the existing front of the tree. And you can see what's happening here is that this main trunk and this secondary trunk are virtually in the same line. So the tree, as it had been potted previously, has a very two-dimensional quality about it, because all of this foliage mass in these two trunks are in the same horizontal line. I reworked this tree substantially last summer and basically took out a lot of dead foliage, eliminated some branches, and rewired the existing tree, the whole tree. And so what I found out in the process is that if the tree were rotated to the right, probably a little less than 45 degrees, the composition gained a lot, I thought. So here's the revised front. And you can see that now this trunk is significantly behind this one. There's more three-dimensionality, more depth to the tree, and even the foliage masses seem to work better. So one of the objectives, the third objective of repotting the tree, was to achieve this new front. And you may say, well, that's a pretty subtle, pretty nuanced kind of thing, but you know what? Bonsai, in some respects, is all about nuance. So anyway, that was the goal there. Here are three containers that I pulled out of our collection that I wanted to test for this tree, for this new composition. And actually, there were two others, but I decided when we got to this point that that those two other pots were going to be too small to accommodate it, and probably too shallow as well. So these were the three that I wanted to test, and we can look at the tree in, I think, in each of these containers. So we're looking at here placement. So here's the tree with its reduced root mass. You can see that even though we've done pruning and we've done all of our chopstick work on the root mass, we've still got a very, very healthy, substantial root mass here. And I decided at that point that was enough. We didn't want to prune anymore. This wood block is here just to support it because the root mass is not totally flat. But that'll be resolved as we put it into the new soil. But I was using this just as a prop so that you could see the tree by itself. And then here was the first container that I looked at, and Japanese container, very nice pot. The tree was snug, but fit nicely into the pot. Plenty of room for the roots to grow. The depth seemed about right. So that was one option. Here was another Sarah Rayner pot, actually. You can see pretty clearly that I might have been able to make this work, but I think it would have endangered the health of the tree. And even visually, this pot seems small for the size of the tree with the two trunks. Third option was I believe this is a Chinese pot. It's an interesting pot, nice feet and so forth. Um, Oh, come on. But in my mind, this container is actually has the same problem with the original one. It's too big. It's too deep. It's too big. It's too massive for the size of this tree and the relative delicacy of the tree. Um, and then finally, here was the original container, which actually looks better than the last one, but still, I believe is too large and too deep for this tree. So essentially, where we ended up is, although this was the first one that we tried, I kind of knew when we first set it in there that this was going to be my choice. So this is the pot that we're going to go with, and I think it's going to make a very nice composition. So the next step in our process is preparing the container. And, something else I wanted to interject here is that before we get into prepping is matching a tree to a new container it presents a number of challenges. And I think there's a tendency, and I certainly have experienced this working with Ryan Neal. Ryan is always attempting to put a tree into, it seems like the smallest possible container, the shallowest, most challenging container. And I appreciate that, and because it's part of the bonsai aesthetic, to have a tree that's growing into what appears to be an almost impossibly small container. But we live in Colorado, and I live at elevation 6,700 feet, and it gets pretty hot, and the sun is pretty intense up here during the summertime. So I have tended over the last few years to put trees into pots that are a little deeper, a little hold water a little better. Because if you live in the Pacific Northwest, you can afford to have a tree in a pot that's pretty shallow and you water all the time, especially if you're a bonsai professional. But I think here it's one has to consider the overall health of the tree and the vigor of the tree and its ability. I mean, even though I'm retired and I do water trees once a day and sometimes twice a day during the summer. It still seems that the health of the tree should dictate sometimes going with a little deeper, a little bigger container. So it's a kind of a judgment call, but I think that one has to take those things into consideration. And so anyway, that was part of the reason for the selection of that particular pot for this tree. So let's talk about prepping the container. There's a couple of things that we're doing in preparing the container for this particular tree. The first of which is we've got to accommodate the drainage of the soil, and all of this, like I indicate here, every aspect of bonsai, installing drainage screens, anchorage devices, putting in the soil, doing all of this is always combining function and aesthetics. So we're always concerned about how does the thing work and how does it look? And that's something that Ryan has drummed into us as students over a period of time. It's always a function, a combination of function and aesthetics. So here are a little, what I call my mouse ear tie downs or mouse ear drainage clips. These are pretty simple little guys, and you can make them, you just make them by hand. All of the drainage clips I use are made with aluminum wire, and usually 2-meter aluminum wire. If you can see, if you look closely, that one portion of this clip is on the back side of the horizontal and one side is on the front. And that's very deliberate because of the way that they're going to be installed in the pot. So we use these to hold down our plastic drainage mesh. Here's the bottom of the pot. We cleaned it up a bit. This pot has obviously been used before for some tree. I don't remember which one. This is a Japanese pot. And we cleaned off some of the old mineral deposits here. We're very fortunate because we have 3 nice big drainage holes in this pot, and we have 4 holes for tie down wire. Some pots don't have wire holes, and we're forced to use the drainage holes for our anchorage wire, which certainly is feasible, but just not as convenient as this kind of arrangement. You can see the signatures of the maker of the pot. This one is typically called a chop, and it's like a stamp of the maker on the bottom of the pot. But interestingly enough, this one also has some handwritten kanji characters. So I'm assuming that the maker did both of these, but I honestly don't know where I got this pot. We have a lot of pots, and I'm just not sure where or when we acquired it. But it is a very nice handmade pot. So we're going to install our drainage mesh, which consists of taking the legs of that Mickey Mouse ears and putting them down through the drainage mesh and to the bottom of the pot, and then flattening them against the bottom. And here, this is, you know, the top of the mesh that's going to be inside the pot. And so here we are pushing down on the bottom of the pot with those extended legs, and inside the pot we're doing this. And I mentioned that the wire was going to be on one side or the other of this horizontal. Well, we're pushing against the horizontal there, and in the opposite direction. This keeps bothering me. In the opposite direction with our other finger. So we're twisting, we're going against one another, and that holds this mesh in place very firmly. However, you have to then go back to the bottom of the pot and straighten out those legs. And I'm so compulsive that I also trim them all to the same length. Then we need to look at our anchorage wires, and let's talk a little bit about anchorage or tie downs for the tree, because we need to think about how we're going to anchor this tree in the pot. The tree we're dealing with right now is fairly straightforward. Actually very straightforward, because we haven't changed the angle or the inclination of the tree. We don't have a situation where the tree's trying to fall out of the pot because of a good deal of its mass is outside of the perimeter of the pot, we have a tree that's basically sitting down in the pot. So we can anchor it fairly simply, and we don't have to be too concerned about it's going somewhere else. So we're going to use a fairly straightforward wire anchorage for the root mass on this tree. Now, if you have a tree, even in a situation like this, where the root mass is fairly substantial, and the tree is going to be sitting down pretty much vertically in the pot, you can use a system that's called a bamboo tie-down system. If you have a very substantial root mass, you can take small portions of bamboo strips and sharpen them and drive them into the root mass from the side, and use those as levers to tie the tree down into the pot with wire. That is a very, very effective way of tying a tree, and it basically holds it very, very nicely, assuming that you can get substantial leverage or substantial purchase, if you will, into the root mass. This tree does not have that kind of significant solid root mass, not solid enough to do that. So we're going to use a wire over the root mass tie down method, fairly traditional, simple tie down method. Another system, if you have, for example, a cascade, if you can imagine a cascade going into a pot, the root mass of the cascade goes into the pot, but most of the foliage and the branches are hanging over the edge of the pot. Well, what does that want to do? It wants to pull the root mass out of the pot. It wants to uproot it, because you've got a whole bunch of weight on the other end, like a lever arm pulling upwards on that root mass. So in that case, a lot of times what we do is we'll insert a screw into the trunk of the tree. Doesn't hurt the tree. Put a screw into the trunk, the back of the trunk, if you will, and use wire to tie it down to counteract that overturning moment, if you will, of the mass of the tree trying to pull it out of the pot. We've done that with a number of trees, and it works very, very well. Another anchorage application is you're tying down the tree and you realize that while the wire or whatever is holding it in place vertically, the tree wants to move laterally from side to side, maybe because it doesn't have enough root mass to keep it from doing that, or it's just shaped that way. In that case, we can use, again, bamboo, our universal tool in bonsai, to cut props, if you will, or struts that will be placed between the root mass and the interior wall of the pot in one or more locations, usually at least two, because if you're putting one on one side, you have to put it on the other. And you're basically propping the root mass against the interior wall of the pot. And that also can work very effectively. In the case of the bamboo struts, or the bamboo hammered into the root mass, as I mentioned before, they're all going to be below the soil surface, so you won't see them, which is another good advantage to those excuse me, to those methods. So I just mentioned that because there's a lot of different methods and strategies for tying a tree into a pot. And but the overall objective of all of those is, number one, to keep the root mass tied down vertically into the soil, and laterally, and to prevent movement, movement from the wind, movement from whatever, from picking up and relocating the tree, whatever. Because any of that movement, remember what we're trying to do is encourage the development of fine roots into the new soil. And any movement like that is going to rip those roots. So we want to keep this tree as stable and as solid as possible. All right, so coming back, we're going to tie down this tree. We're going to run two tie down wires, one between these two wire holes and another one between these two. I encourage you, I definitely encourage you to be very precise and careful in putting in these wires. What I'm doing here with my hands is measuring the distance between these two holes and allowing enough slack or slop, if you will, in the length of that piece of wire that I know I'm not going to use it all, but I've got enough to tie it down up above. But I want to make sure that the distance between where these wires are bent corresponds to these holes. And then I want to use my pliers to create a 90-degree bend right at that point, right there and right here. So that wire underneath the pot will lay flat. It'll look good, but more importantly, it will not have any slack in it. So when I pull up above through the soil, I'm not trying to pull out a big bunch of wire down below. That wire is laying flat against the bottom of the pot, and I can rely on that. So I'm doing that here, I'm doing that here. Now I'm threading the wire. It looks like these are two different pieces of wire, but they're actually one big piece. I'm threading that wire down through the holes, and this is what it'll look like when you're done. Flip the pot over, and here we've got our tie down wires, all of our drainage meshes in place with our Mickey Mouse ears. And now we're ready to put some soil in this pot. Oops. Okay, you recall that when we talked about putting our soil together, we had two different kinds of soil. We had the so-called drainage mix, or what Ryan now refers to as aeration mix, the larger size particles. We're going to put one particle layer of those large particles at the bottom of the pot. They're going to serve to encourage drainage and aeration, oxygen into the bottom area of the pot. So here we are putting our drainage layer in. Excuse me. And this is what it looks like when we've got that bottom of the pot covered. And the next step on top of that is we put a layer of the fill mix, the smaller particle size. Cover the whole top of that soil. Then we make a mound of soil in the center, just pretty much in the center of the root mass that we're putting in when we're planting the tree. Ends up looking something like this. And then we're ready to set the tree down in there. The purpose of having this mound is because if you think about it, we can chopstick and basically bring soil into the whole perimeter of the pot, but we really can't get underneath it. So we want to make sure that the underside of the root mass, the sheen, is really filled as much as possible with new soil that the roots can grow into. And sometimes if you have a tree with a really, really solid, hard core root mass, it's important even to make holes in through that root mass from the top in several locations where you can pour soil down in, because you know that it's so dense. In this case, I didn't believe it was necessary to do that. Now we're going to plant the tree. We've got the container ready. We know how we're going to anchorage. We know how we're going to tie down the tree. And we want to talk about how we're going to go about doing that. Now, our photos are a little deficient in this area, because the first thing we're going to do when we take this tree and set it down onto that mound of soil in the center of the pot is we're going to put our hands on top of the root mass, on top of the surface of the soil, and we're going to move that root mass forward and backward once, with putting pressure down on the soil, and we're going to move it side to side once to settle the tree in there. Then we're going to twist the root mass a couple of times to settle it down in. We've got to be real careful when we're doing that, that we're respecting where we want the front of that tree to be, because we, you know, part of the objective of repotting this tree is to change the front and the orientation of the tree with respect to the pot. So we've got to make sure that we've got that aligned, and we've got to make sure that we're really settling the tree down in. Once we've done that, the tree should be fairly stable in the soil. And we can proceed in either one of two directions. If the tree is not super stable and we're not comfortable yet applying our tie-down wires or anchorage wires, we can do some initial bulk fill. Now, what do we mean by bulk fill? Well, bulk fill is we're really just pouring soil into these major voids under or adjacent to the root mass. And we're using our chopstick not so much to solidify the soil, but just to coax it into those areas where we're trying to get that bulk fill to go. So, you know, in this case, the tree was stable enough that I could go ahead and tie down the anchorage wires before I did the bulk fill. But in a lot of instances, it really helps to put that initial fill of soil in under and around the root mass to stabilize the tree. And then we can go about tying down our anchorage wires. What we're seeing here, and I talk about it in the dialogue I did for this, is that, you know, it's not just a matter of running the wire anywhere. We're going to try to run the wire where it has least damage to the roots, and in this case, because we're running wire on top of the root mass, we're gonna avoid running it over the top of small roots. So I'm feeding it through underneath these connecting roots here and over the top of the soil. And in some cases, I'll even use my pliers, like here, to pull that wire through and make sure that I've taken the slack out of it. You can see I've run the wire underneath these roots here, so that if it's necessary in some cases you can't avoid it, to run the wire on top of surface roots, then we use a cushion with some a thin piece of rubber on top of the root to cushion it from the intrusion of the wire. But here I'm just pulling the wire and make sure it's taut. And I elected to, remember the wires we put in underneath, I elected to run them diagonally. So we're going to have one pair of wire running this way, one pair of wire running that way. And that should tie this root mass down nicely. You can see we've a little out of focus, but we've tied those wires together. The first thing I do is I twist them together with my hand, and then I use the pliers to pull them up. You have to pull upward in order to take the slack out of that tie down, and then twist. And one of the things that you have to become proficient with is doing this with one hand without losing the grip on the pliers. Get those tied down pretty nicely, and then you can twist them in place. You can see what kind of pressure is being applied here to the root mass. Then you can come in with your wire clippers and clip that off right about there, and use your chopstick. Here you can see the diagonal wire, one going this way, one going that way, and they're both tied down. Then you can use your chopstick to push these remaining ends into the soil so they virtually disappear. And this will all get covered with soil anyway. So you'll see when we're done, you can't even see them. Once you've done all that, the next thing is to see, is the tree stable? So this doesn't show very well, but what I'm really doing here is I've grabbed the top of this gin, and I'm just pushing it to see if I can get any lateral movement out of the tree, and I didn't. So it was pretty well anchored. The other thing you have to remember is once you begin to chopstick soil into the container, that in itself, once it gets compacted to some extent, will stabilize the tree, but it's not a substitute for proper anchorage. It just helps. And there are instances where you might have a little bit of movement. You say, well, I get soil in here, I should be pretty solid. And that often is the case. So now we're down to completing the process, which is putting in the soil, chopsticking it, contouring the soil, and then placement of top dressing. So let's talk about chopsticks. Chopsticks, as we use the term, are a completely different animal for that than that which you use to eat food in a Japanese restaurant. These are chopsticks, but real chopsticks, the ones you use to eat with, are useless pretty much for bonsai. These chopsticks are made by taking a hunk of bamboo and stripping out strips. You can strip out a strip along the edge of that hunk of bamboo of any size you want. And you can see they range from very fine here to pretty thick. And here's a shorty. And you know why the shorty? Because sometimes you have to chopstick underneath a branch, and you can't really get there with a longer piece. But these chopsticks, the reason these are important is that the bamboo is incredibly strong. They're very substantial. And how we shape them is we leave the skin side, if you will, of the bamboo on, and then we use a grinder to create a sloped surface on the tip of the chopstick and on either side of it. So you end up with a pointed tip that's sloped on the side, on the flesh side, if you will, of the bamboo. And by using that is like almost like a little shovel that enables us to, or facilitates getting the soil into the container. So the first step is what I referred to before as bulk fill. This is just putting soil into the container and using your chopstick to encourage it into those big voids, those holes around the outside or underneath the root mass. We're not really pushing a lot. We're not really chopsticking in the true sense of the word. We're just using the chopstick to shove that soil underneath and get it uniformly around into those voids. The real chopsticking occurs here. So once you've done all the bulk fill, then it's a question of, I want to get a uniform density of soil all the way through, and I want to eliminate any significant holes in that soil, any voids. This requires a great deal of focus and patience. Patience, because you want to work a particular area, even though it may only be a couple of inches wide. You want to work that and work it until you're convinced that there's no more voids underneath there. There's no more holes underneath there. You've filled it with soil. So the process is to take the chopstick, push it down between the edge of the pot and the soil all the way to the bottom, all the way inside into the bottom. Then you use your other hand with the soil scoop to pour soil on top of the on the surface here, and you'll see that my left hand is always working with the right hand. So the purpose is, you don't remove that chopstick, you keep it down there and you keep working it vertically and feeding soil into that location with your left hand, so that you'll see as you work it that the soil is continuing to go down where you have that chopstick, until you get to the point where it's really pushing the chopstick out, because there's no more space for the soil. So you do that in a little area, then you move to the next area, do it again, and you move to the next area and do it again. It may take you a full hour to fully chopstick this whole pot. And you also have to look for areas at an angle in the soil mass to see where there might be a void. It's a feeling process, and it's not something that you can learn by talking about it. You have to really experience it and sense it, and then you'll begin to see what that means to really chopstick the soil and really make sure that you've got a continuous density and consistency of soil throughout the container. Very, very important part of the process. Again, a lot of patience and a lot of focus, and this is not something you do casually. It's something that needs real attention. The next step in the process, if you've been doing chopsticking correctly, you'll end up with a whole lot of soil on top of the here, because you keep pouring soil in, and you're chopsticking around, and then you end up with this residual soil. Well, the objective is to now contour the soil. How do you want this to look? How do you want the slope of the soil to look? And you can accomplish that with a bonsai whisk broom like this, and you simply sweep off the surface soil that is no longer needed here. Catch it in a soil scoop and put it back into your soil container, because it's perfectly good bonsai soil. So you do that all the way around, contouring, getting that soil surface to look just like you want it to look, and removing excess soil that doesn't need to be there anymore. Because remember, everything down below has been chopstick and is perfectly uniform. There you go. Next, I like to use a little tool. I don't know what other people call it. I call it a soil patter. And the objective here, once you've done your soil contouring, is to create a shallow gutter at the perimeter of the soil, and in the process, kind of pat together the soil that remains. The objective is not to push it down and make it rock solid. It's just to create this gutter The purpose of the gutters is obvious. I mean, it's when you water this tree, you don't want water to run off the edge of the pot, off the soil, surface of the soil, off the edge of the pot and down. You want it to run across the surface of the soil and down in. So this creating this gutter is very important in terms of how the tree's going to absorb the water that you put on it. So you go all the way around the perimeter of the container, and you do this, and you can see what it yields as a really nice rain gutter around the edge. The very last step in the potting process is creating or putting on top dressing. So what is top dressing? Well, ideally it's moss. Moss is not that easy to grow in our climate, but I have found anyway. But here's how you make it. The moss for top dressing is made with 50% long fibers sphagnum moss and 50% collected growing live moss. So here I've got my screen 1/4-inch grid. I'm grinding sphagnum moss through that grid into a container there, and then I'm grinding live moss through that same grid into the container. What it ends up being is a fine mix, and this is a bit of a fakery because the moss that I was grinding back then was not really good moss. I just did it as an illustration. So this is just sphagnum moss. But if you combine the two, you end up with a sort of a light green mixture that goes on the surface of the soil, and it has the sphagnum moss serves to hold it all together because of its fibers, and it doesn't need to be a heavy layer. About what you see here is all you need. It's just a thin layer of this stuff, and eventually, if it grows and turns into real moss, it'll form a carpet of moss onto the top of the soil. I can figure out how to get to the next. Here we go. After you've applied that top dressing, you need to take your squirt bottle and wet it. Why? Because otherwise it tends to blow away, and you want to moisten it so that when you water the tree, it doesn't just wash away. But this just moistening it thoroughly with a spray bottle will prevent that from happening. Then it was a nice day when we did this, so we took the tree outside and watered it. I like to water trees that have just been repotted with a sprinkling can as opposed to a spray nozzle on my garden hose. It's gentler. The objective here is to water it thoroughly, and then let it sit for about 15 or 20 minutes and water it again thoroughly. The reason is we're trying to wash out of the soil any remaining dust and fines. And you'll see that the water coming out, especially the first time, coming out of the bottom of the pot is going to be murky because it's got that stuff in it. And then the next time you water 15, 20 minutes later, it'll look clearer. And once you've done that a couple of times and you're convinced you've thoroughly watered the tree, you're done. There it is. The last caveat I would throw in is that trees that are repotted, especially at this time of year when we're still looking at potential frost, must be protected. If these three came out of a cold frame, which it did not, by the way, because I was growing it in the greenhouse, because I'd done so much work on it last summer. But if it came out of a cold frame and it was repotted, it would go into the greenhouse, or it'll go into someplace at your house, garage or whatever, where it's protected from severe temperatures and protected from desiccating winds, because they're very delicate. I shouldn't say delicate, they're more susceptible at this point in time. So protect the tree after it's been repotted. The second thing is fertilization. You never want to fertilize a repotted tree for at least a month after it's been repotted. The whole objective is to get those real fine roots growing into that new soil medium, and sometimes fertilizer can be detrimental to that process. So hold off on fertilization for at least a month and let the tree get established and grow and be happy. And finally, this is my canine Japanese sensei, and he told me to say that he approves of this message.